What is up, everyone? Welcome back and happy new year to everyone. Let's jump straight in to the project that we'll be tackling. We're going to be tackling this, and we're going to break it up into 4 different stages. We're going to start off with our smoke simulation and look at how we can use a falloff to drive our smoke simulation. Then we're going to use that smoke simulation to affect our cloth in Vellum, and then we're going to affect our particles or our confetti, and then finally we'll wrap it all together and do a nice render of it all. I am in Houdini 19.5.435, which is the latest supported version by Redshift, and I am on Redshift 3.5.12. Just something else to note, I am having an issue where I can't use my GPU for Vellum, it breaks. So I'm currently running on CPU, which is a bit of a problem, and hopefully Side Effects fixes this. This is a bug on their side, which they've identified. And so right now I have to use CPU for everything, which is a little bit slower, but it does work and it doesn't crash. So if you have some crashes and you're on the latest NVIDIA drivers, that's probably why. So let's jump in and let's start making something. Let's start off by just making our geo container. And as always, we'll call this working, and this will be yellow, and we'll dive inside. For this one, I wanted to use fonts, and I wanted to kind of show you some of the tips and tricks that I use when playing with fonts, because sometimes fonts in Houdini are not the most favorite thing to use because you get all sorts of errors, as you will see. So let's just start, and I'm just going to use a match size just to get this on top. So I use min, and now it's sitting on the floor. And let me also just make my background dark. All right, and I can get rid of that. All right, so now I have this. And let me just drop down a null so I don't have that silly bounding box. All right, so what I want to do is I want to extrude this text, and I then want to remesh it and get something going like that. But before I do that, this font works okay, but sometimes you get a font that when you try and remesh it, I can actually show it with this font because it does sort of break. You get some really weird artifacts. You can see here how I get all these like funny, and it's not very uniform. Even if I make this smaller, you can see here how this is kind of stretched, and you don't get a uniform remesh. So something that you can do to try and fix this is to do like a little bit of a workaround. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a group, and we're going to just call this edge, and I want this to be an edge group and unshared edges. So now I just have the edges, and there's a labs node, labs edge group to curve. And if I select my group now, you can see now I just have these edges. Now the difference between doing something like an ends and this labs node, you'll see here if I unroll this, I get this line over here, which I don't want, where the labs doesn't give me that. So that's why I'm using the labs and not the ends. So now that I have this, I'm going to now resample these curves. Because if you have a look at the points here, you'll see that it's quite ununiform. It's maybe a bit easier to see here. You can see there's a lot of points here, but then down here, there's not a lot, and then here there are a lot and not a lot and a lot. Whereas when we resample them, we can now get a very nice uniform points distribution along our whole mesh. And depending on how accurate you need this to be, if this is kind of like a client logo or something, you might need to go quite high. But for now, I'll just keep it at 1. And then we can use an ends, and I'm going to just use this to close this. So if I do a closed straight, you can see this is looking good except for this. And there's a node called the hole sop, and this will just make our hole. Now this kind of looks exactly the same as this. It doesn't look very different other than the fact that we now have uniform points. So when I try the same remesh and I turn off points and I see the wireframe, you can see there's a lot more uniform triangles going around here. And I can now change this to get kind of more uniform, and maybe what I want to do here is just make it not so strict. And now I have really uniform triangles across my whole logo compared to this where I have this horrible stretching. So this is just something to keep in mind if you ever want to kind of get a logo with some really nice edges, and then you can use this resample to kind of give you some nice uniform stuff. This is also something I do sometimes with Vellum cloth when the remesh isn't working properly. I'll resample it with this edge to try and get a nice clean edge, and then I'll remesh it, and then I get a nice clean mesh, which is something really useful to know about. Okay, so moving on from that, let's just come back to what we're doing here. And what we're doing here is we're going to poly extrude this, and let's just push this out. And now we actually want to do another remesh, and we just want to remesh the whole font. Now, I'm going to run this through VDBs in a second, so I'm not super worried about what this looks like. Let me just increase this. So I don't mind some of these jagged edges and stuff like that. So we can do a VDB from polygons. And turn this down, maybe a little bit lower. And then VDB convert. We'll convert it to polygons. Okay, so we need to make this quite a lot higher. Yeah. And now you can see that we're not getting nice rounding around these edges. We can try VDB smooth and see if that gives us what we want. All right, so that's starting to look better. Something else that we can do is we can use a smooth node before our VDBs. And this kind of will just smooth these edges as much as we want. And this will just help VDB. So this is without and with. It's very subtle, but I think it does help. And we can maybe push this even more. And let's jump this to Gaussian so it makes it really nice and smooth. All right, so that's looking good. But now I want this a little bit fatter, so we can use a VDB reshape. And this just lets us increase or dilate. So I can make it really fat, or I can make it really thin. So let's just go a little bit fatter. And now we get this. Now this looks really nice. I really like that. But there's obviously way too many polygons. And so I can now remesh this to get something a lot nicer and cleaner and easier to work with. Let's try 0.5. All right, maybe 2 or 3. Okay, that's 0.2 is looking pretty good. What I do want to do here maybe is just make it a little bit fatter. Yeah, that looks cool. So now I have this nice fat font with the nice low resolution mesh. That looks really nice. So I basically went from this to this. And yeah, that looks really nice for me. So we'll keep this. Let me just control. I'm holding A and then pulling down with my mouse, and then it kind of just lines these up. So the next thing I want to do is just bring down this match size again, because I'm inflating this. It's probably not sitting perfectly on the floor anymore. Yeah, so now it's sitting on the floor. I just found this easier to work with when it's on the floor. So the next thing that I did was I moved these letters into place, and we will do that in a bit. But before we do that, I just want to talk to you about the Pyro and the whole setup of Pyro, and then we will, after we've talked about the theory and the setup of that, we'll move the letters into place and then build the actual setup that we're going to do. We're going to start with the Pyro source. And we need a volume rasterize attributes and a Pyro solver. So these are kind of the 3 building blocks of building a Pyro simulation. We'll build our Pyro source, and I'm going to change this to volume scatter, and I'm going to initialize smoke. Now we want this to be a little bit lower, maybe something like that. And I'm going to copy this parameter, and we're going to paste this into the voxel size here. So paste as relative reference, as well as in the Pyro solver, the voxel size, paste as relative reference. So these are all now linked. The next thing we want to do is in this volume rasterize attributes, I want to just bring in my density and my temperature. And reset my viewport. Okay, so we get this now. And if we hit play, we get this beautiful smoke simulation. Fairly incredible. What we can do is turn off this buoyancy, and you'll see now that that was lifting it up. Now it's doing absolutely nothing. And what we want to do is we want to play with this disturbance and this turbulence. So if we just turn this turbulence on, you can see this kind of just gives me a nice like warped look, and it's just warping it around nicely, which is cool. And disturbance just does kind of like a slightly smaller fine breakup. And I found that this just breaks it up so that you don't get those big mushroom clouds. Okay, so we're going to play with those in a second. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to add in some velocity. So let's build our velocity, and then we'll talk about how we're going to create our fall off to animate all of this. So the thing that I want to do now is I want to have kind of an outward velocity. So you can imagine that an explosion is going to come in and it's just going to shoot outwards like this. So to build that, what I'm going to do is use a centroid, the extract centroid. If I plug this in here, you can see I just get a point that is the center of this kind of bounding box, if you would call it that. And then I can use an attribute wrangle. And this is going to be create V. I'll plug in these points, and the Pyro source just creates points. So you can do whatever you want on these points as you normally would. And so what I want to do now is I want to take this center point and I want to look at each of these points to this point, and I want to create a direction. You can imagine that there's a point over here, and each of these other points on the 2022 is going to look at this point and create a direction towards itself, right? And I'm going to use this direction to create a velocity field. And so the way we could do this is the first thing I want to do is just create, we'll get the point. So this point, because I need to bring it in. So I'm going to look at input number 1, which is 0, 1. So it's the second one. I want to look at its position value, which is P, and there's only 1 point. So I'm going to use the value 0 for the point. Now, if you have lots of points, you can use at ptnum or at rd, depending on how you set it up. The next thing I want to do is I want to create a direction, and this is going to be my current position minus the p-pos. So my current position minus the centroid point. So it's going to create a direction facing outwards. And we can visualize this by creating an actual attribute. These are not attributes. These are just kind of stored within the wrangle, but you can't use them. But as soon as I create this, you can see it's now created an attribute here. And I can visualize this attribute like this. And now you can see that I have this outward facing velocity vector trail. And I can further drive this home if I add a transform in here and I move this around. You can see that these points now have kind of this value. And if I add a popnet and I just pipe this in, let me just to demonstrate this, say all points, turn off this. And if I hit play, nothing will happen because I need to change this to V. And if I hit play, they will go in the direction that we create here. So if I turn this away, now they should all just shoot out, and they do. So they're kind of shooting, it looks like they're shooting towards us, but they're actually shooting outwards, which is what we want. So I don't need a particle network or that. So now I have my velocity over there. So the next thing we need to do here is just to add V into this. And if we go back to frame 1 and hit play, you can see now it's pushing everything outwards. So far this is looking good. The other thing we want to do is just do some attribute adjust vector. And I like to just kind of create some more kind of differences to this. So I'm going to do the direction first, and I want to just do a noise, and this is visualize velocity. So you can see that this is, and now I'm just adjusting it ever so slightly, something along these lines. And this is just so that it's slightly more random. And the next thing I'll do now is I'll do the same thing, but for length. And if I disable that, we can have a look, and I'm going to multiply it so that the values that I set here will either be 0 or 1. And so I'm going to use a noise, and I'm going to use a min-max, but I'm going to use a remap. And so now I can get some values that are completely 0 and some that are really high. So you can see now that there's some here that have no velocity because it's set to 0, and some that have more. So we'll maybe do something like that. All right, so that looks cool. And this doesn't need to be something specific. I'm just playing with some random values. So it just kind of adds a little bit more randomness to what we have going on here. Obviously, once we add in turbulence and disturbance, let's just crank those up. You can see you get like this crazy thing going on here. Maybe these are too big. There we go. All right, so that's some cool looking smoke. But now I got to the point where I wanted to do kind of like a fall off. Now, in general, the fall off does work sort of in SOPs, and I'll show you, but there's some things that it doesn't work super well. And so the main one that doesn't work well is this disturbance. I found that no matter what I tried in this, I couldn't get disturbance to be animated over time. And without disturbance, I found that I didn't get enough breakup to kind of give a nice smoke simulation. And so let me show you, let's set up the fall off, and then let me show you how I overcame the problem of disturbance. I'm going to use my trusty old MOPS shape fall off. And again, I'm going to run this over points. So I'll run it down here. And we can flip this -90. Okay, and let's move this down here, animate it maybe 75 frames. And on this side, we can maybe make it slightly smaller. Let's preview this. Okay, so it's 0 and 1, and we can add maybe just a bit of noise. Just so that it's not so uniform. Okay, so that looks cool. And now we need to use an attribute wrangle. And the reason for this is that we need to adjust these values. And the two that we want to adjust is the velocity, and we're going to use the temperature that this is creating to drive all the other fall-offs. So we have V at V, and what I want this to do is I want to times this by MOPS fall-off. So basically V will be 0, and then when MOPS has gone all the way through, velocity will be exactly the same as it was before. And I want to do the same for temperature. Okay, so the only thing I'm doing now is I'm using MOPS to reveal on these two attributes, velocity and temperature. So let me remap attributes. And if I feed this in here and we hit play, let me go back to frame 1. Let's see what we get. Okay, let me turn off these two values and let's see, does velocity work? Yes, so velocity is animating on over time. You can see that it's affecting each element as it comes. So far that is looking good. But if we remove velocity, just so now we have nothing in our simulation, and we try turbulence, what we need to do with turbulence is instead of this control field being density, let's change it to temperature, because temperature is what we're adjusting here. You can see now we slowly are affecting this as well. Okay, so that's working great. And then disturbance. So we'll go down, use control field, and I want to use temperature. And if I hit play, nothing happens. And as I said, I have tried many things to try and get this to work in this setup, and I could not get it to work. And so I found another workaround, and I actually prefer it to do everything with that. So I'm going to turn all these off, and inside here I'm going to turn off temperature, and I'm just going to bring in density. And I'm actually going to move these onto the side. I'm going to create another one of these, and here I'm going to use temperature and velocity. I'm going to create a null, and I'm going to say out MOPS. Doesn't really matter what I call this. And I'm going to feed this into here. Okay, so just to recap, right now we have nothing happening on our smoke, but we have this. I'm going to copy this null. I'm going to dive inside here, and I'm going to create a volume source. Okay, and what this allows me to do is inside the solver, I'm updating every frame, just like in Vellum or RBD. Once you're inside, it's updating every frame. So inside here, I'm going to just paste in this SOP path. So that's good. And now I want to bring in an attribute. The first one I want to bring in is temperature. And I'm going to pull this in with a value of 50. And if you're wondering why I'm using these values, it's just because when I look at my sourcing over here, it's sourcing in temperature with pool and 50. And I don't even need to source in any of these. I'm just going to source in density. So far, again, nothing's changing because all I'm doing now is bringing in temperature, but temperature is not affecting anything. But if we, on this side, we add in a gas turbulence, which is the same as we had outside. And instead of density, I'm using temperature, and I want to make the control influence 1. You can see now we're getting the same as we were getting outside. We're controlling it now by this. Now, why that's cool, we had this before, is if I use a gas disturb and I pipe this in and I do the same thing here, temperature. Let's just make this really high so we can see that it's doing something. So now I just have the gas disturb, nothing else. And you can see that this is now being affected by my fall off. And it looks pretty bad because it's on its own, but it's working. So if I combine these two now, I'm getting a nice combination of everything, all being driven by this temperature fall off. So the next thing I want to do now is just disable these two. So I again have nothing happening, and I want to add in another attribute, and this is going to be my velocity. Now velocity comes in at V because that's what I specified it as here, V, and it's a volume. So that's great. And I need to target the field of Vel, and we're just going to add it in like that. So if we hit play now, velocity is also now being animated with my fall off inside our solver, just like we had before, but now we can use gas disturb and gas turbulence. So now we get everything that's working really nicely together, and we can play with these settings to kind of break up this smoke to get something that's really nice. So for the turbulence, let's do a value of 2, and maybe let's make this a little bit smaller. And for the gas disturb, this is obviously too high. Let's try a value of 16, and let's just see what this looks like. Yeah, so now we're getting some really nice breakup where the velocity is pushing it outwards. So we get that outwards movement, but then the turbulence and the disturb are breaking it up. The other thing you can of course do is there are other gas nodes. Now I'm not a huge expert on any of these, but you can try shredding, and you can add in these, and you can just keep adding in with this control field and seeing what these do, right? So let's just disable this, and if you want to disable this, you can just deactivate the velocity. So now we're just going to get shredding, and let's just see. So shredding also does something pretty cool if you want this kind of behavior. That's one thing you can do, and I think there's a whole bunch here that you can play around with. All right, so let's just turn these back on and turn on our velocity. So now we have a kind of a really cool little system to get these animated values in. So what we want to do now is create a camera and put these in the right place, and then redo our fall off so that it affects it in the right way. So let's just create a camera. And I did this for kind of the nice new vertical format that everyone hates. I'll do 100mm. Let's jump into our camera, and let's just pull back something like this. And I don't want any rotation or anything. I'll just keep it like pretty centered on. And then let's talk about how we can split up our letters. Okay, so I'm going to just pull this down. I'm going to just tie these together like this and like that. And over here, I'm going to add a connectivity. I just find this makes it really easy to split these apart. So what I can do now is just do a blast. And I'm going to say points and then at class equals 0. So delete non-selected. So now I've got 1, 2, and the last one is, oh, these are reversed. Okay, well, like this. Okay, and now I'm just going to create a transform node. And there are many ways that you can do this. You can scatter them onto points or whatever, but because I kind of wanted to art direct how these looked, I just am manually going to transform these into place. So we'll put the 2 up there, the 0 over there, 2 here, and there's 2 down here, and this camera we can zoom in a little bit. All right, so I think that's something similar to what I had before. And so what we can do now is just grab this and pipe this into here. We can move all this down. And maybe what we should do here is just create a null. And we'll just call this in smoke. And as always, I can't leave these uncolored. Okay, so we have our setup, but now our fall off is kind of doing a linear thing. And what I wanted to do here was do a spherical. And so let's just delete this and move it into the middle like that. And then I just did a expansion. So let's just go up to frame maybe 5, hit enter, and then frame 100, and we're going to just expand this till the whole thing is covered. All right, so we have that. Boom. And then what I want to do here is just make sure that it's happening quite fast, and then let's just turn the noise down a little bit. Yeah, okay, so it's gonna go boom, and then it should explode. Okay, so we can then preview that. Let's just have a look and see how this looks. Yeah, that looks quite cool. It's happening very fast now. You can see that the whole thing's basically happening over 3 frames, which we don't want. So velocity is growing on, but you can see that the whole thing is growing on really quickly. So by frame 19, it's already on. So let's just fix our fall off to adjust for that. We can make this a bit bigger. And I don't think it needs to be so big. So let's turn off velocity. Let's view our fall off again. And let's just make this. Okay, yeah, so that seems a lot better. And maybe not so steep. Okay, and then if we visualize velocity again, we play. All right, so that's starting to feel a little bit better. Let's have a look at the simulation. Okay, so that's starting to feel better. Now it's going in a cool direction. Something else I want to do now is just kind of play a little bit more with these volume adjust. You can see that they're a little bit too, what's the word, uniform in one direction. So we can play with, and we should label these. This is the dir, and this is the length. And we can play with the direction a little bit more and just kind of get something. So that's without any influence. Maybe just get something a little bit more random. Maybe 0 centered. Okay, yeah, that's kind of cool. And I'm just playing now. I don't really know. Okay, let's go with that. And then the length, just make sure that we have some nice pockets of no velocity, just so we get some nice kind of change, and it's not all so uniform. So let's take a look at that. Okay, I like that. And obviously we need to add in our other 2 components. So let's see what this looks like. All right, this looks cool. The thing I want to do now is just kind of pull my camera back quite a bit so that we can see more of it. Boom. Yeah, and remember, this is still very low resolution. We will jump this up before our final simulation, but I think this looks really nice. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do 2 simulations. The one I'm going to do is I'm going to file cache a low res. So this will be a low res smoke. And then I will do another one. And so this one here will be low res. And this one will be high res. And the reason for that is we're going to affect Vellum as well as a particle network with the smoke simulation. And if it's too high res, then it just makes Vellum go slowly, and we don't need all the resolution for advecting some cloth and some particles. It can be quite low resolution. So I find that it's a lot faster to just do two separate ones. This one will be for our render smoke, and this one will be for our advection smoke. And for our high res, we can maybe pull it down to something like 0.5. And see, this one is actually affected by the same values. So it's something just to keep in mind that you will need to change it, and it'll change everything else before you file cache. So let's do the low res one first. All right, so my file cache has finished and it looks good. Something I noticed though was that my smoke just kind of keeps emitting, which I don't want. And so what we can do is on this Pyro solver in the sourcing tab, we can just say limit source frame range. And so what this is going to do is it's going to emit for 12 frames and then it will stop. And I also want to make sure that this cycle length is off. So it's not starting again at frame 120. It just stops when it's finished. Okay, so I'll run this again and I'll see you in a few seconds. All right, so our low res simulation is now done and it looks cool. And you can see now that it dissipates and then it's gone. So that's cool. I'm very happy with this. And so we just need to make sure that this limit range is now set onto the high res one and everything else can stay as it is. And we're just going to go in here and change this to something a lot lower, maybe 0.6. All right, so that's starting to look nice. There's a lot of detail there. 0.6 is maybe a little bit high. We'll go to 0.8. And I am now going to cache this. And we may even just increase these sub steps. And everything else looks good. So let me cache this and I'll see you in a bit. All right, so I finished caching the high res and you can see it here. It may be a little bit fast for what we're going for, but what we're going to do is just kind of leave it where it is right now. And then once we set up the Vellum, we can see what it looks like and how intense it is. Maybe it's way too fast. And then we can adjust it again and resim. And we'll then just keep playing with the low res until we're happy. And once we're happy with everything, we'll do a final high res sim for render. That's kind of my general workflow for these kinds of things. The last thing I want to do before we wrap up this first part is just kind of set this up and get it ready for the next part. The first thing I want to do here is delete. And because this one, we're only going to use the velocity from this, I want to just delete everything other than the velocity. And delete non-selected. So we won't see anything now, but you can see we still have this velocity field. And then the other thing we can do is just clean all the attributes. And mine by default is set up like this. But you'll see now that the velocity has been taken away. So we need to just make sure that we keep the name attribute because that's what is setting this as velocity. So instead of having all these crazy attributes now, we just have velocity and this is what we want. So we can add a null. And we'll call this out vel. And as always, now we have a velocity field that we can use in Vellum. We're going to just move this over and this one. And we'll make this red. And so now we are ready to render. But now we don't want velocity on this one. We want density. So we can actually see it and we just have the density field and everything else is cleaned. So for now, the smoke is done. We will probably have to resim a few times as we carry on iterating in the process, but this is the basic smoke simulation setup done. And I'll see you in part 2 where we tackle Vellum.